as what the internet did for business, AI is going to be as big, if not bigger.
The introduction of Microsoft Copilot, how does that impact SharePoint design?
There's going to be so many positives. If you look back at the different generations of people who have worked, how they look for documents and files and things like that is going to be different. It's all about making information easier to access.
High level, what kind of advice would you have for somebody that is thinking being a SharePoint consultant might be beneficial?
I think it's the next generation of how people are going to interact with company data, information, policies, procedures. Eventually, there'll be a large portion of people that will never even interface with SharePoint as a website. They'll interface with it via a GPT.
How do you feel that your technical background has prepared you for the role you are in now?
On every type of role in the IT industry, support, project management, software development, leading teams, consulting. Anyone who's worked in a small business will kind of know you have to wear a lot of different hats.
Why, in your opinion, is it so important for consultants to have both the technical skills, but more importantly, the soft skills?
If I was to give kind of like a piece of value, something away as part of this session,
Hey, welcome to the show. My name is Griffin the host of Citizen Developer, and today I have with me a friend, Dougie Wood. Dougie, before I even read his intro, I mean, he's a humble guy, but he's an expert, especially when it comes to SharePoint. But let me get into his intro here. Dougie's career began as a SharePoint consultant, where his dedication and expertise quickly propelled him into a SharePoint development manager role, where he took on a myriad of responsibilities ranging from project delivery and client communication to team coordination and compliance. And with a knack for innovation and a keen eye for creative solutions, Dougie transitioned seamlessly into the role of head of business applications at Valto, which is a distinguished Microsoft partner. And today he serves as the creative director, where he leads the charge in running the creative and marketing functions, leveraging his technical acumen to drive impactful strategies and initiatives. Dougie, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Griffin.
Yeah, absolutely. I kind of the last part of your intro there, and kind of where I was wanting to start the conversation. Explain what a creative director is, and absolutely no disrespect, but explain what this role is and why you had a desire to jump into this.
Sure. No, to be honest, it's the first question I always get asked, and I always in my head, because and it'll make more sense as I explain the role. The role is very kind of marketing led. So think of it as more like a marketing director kind of thing. But I like the kind of the term creative director, and it makes me think of there's a very kind of famous meme that Kanye West is talking about Lady Gaga being the creative director of Polaroid. And he says something like, well, what does she know about cameras?
Because look at Gaga. She's the creative director of Polaroid. I like some of the Gaga songs. What the does she know about cameras?
To a certain extent, it's a little bit like she's lending her kind of like public face, her image, her personal brand, her experiences of that industry, and in reality, she will have experiences of that industry, to the Polaroid brand. And to a certain extent, that's what a creative director is doing. It's using and leveraging their knowledge. So I'm not a marketeer by trade at all. As you just said, you listed off my my CV really well there, but I've worked in technical roles. Like, that's what I've done for the past 15 years or so. And eventually it got to a point where I'd kind of done every type of role in the IT industry in terms of support, project management, software development, leading teams, consulting, doing all those different pieces. But throughout all of that, my kind of passion and kind of hobby and that side of things has always been around creating content, communicating things to people. And that basically is what kind of led into that role. So I was already doing things like creating YouTube videos and blog articles and speaking at conferences and doing all these things which build up a kind of personal profile. So eventually, within the company I was working in, they recognized that essentially, and we'd grown into a position where there was a need for a kind of full-time marketing director slash, say, creative director, which does some of these kind of things. So to kind of, it's a bit of a waffly answer, but to kind of give it a summary, what I kind of get involved with is the kind of marketing of Microsoft products for my company, to get the word out, to use my sort of personal profile and personal brand to um, essentially encourage more potential opportunities.
So these different responsibilities that you now have as, a creative director compared to the head of business applications, or
Yeah,
maybe a solution architect, that was a term that I think a lot of other people, would obviously recognize.
yeah.
What are some things that you find that you like about these different responsibilities that you have as a creative director?
So I suppose the there's different kind of roles, different types of things, and there's good. I suppose there's pros and cons of doing different things. So I'd say I'll start off actually with saying some of the cons of what I currently do is um, I have to still stay up to date with what's going on and products and what's coming through and that sort of stuff. And also be up to date enough that I can give value to people, because really the secret source of marketing is to give value to people. The reason why your YouTube channel is successful is because you can give value to people. So, I mean, people are coming there, they can get that. They're not just coming because you're a pretty face. They're they're coming because they're getting value, they're understanding things, and that's essentially the point of marketing. Um, so I've got to stay up to date. So the kind of con of this kind of role, though, is that I'm no longer kind of doing a lot of technical hands-on stuff. So I have to find sort of time in my own time to build out proof of concepts and things like that and whatever, which is fine. It's something I do. Um, but the kind of pros of it is I can kind of share kind of knowledge with people. I stay quite current with what's going on and what products are coming down the line, and recently been playing a lot with Copilot and things like that, and um, just kind of staying in the front of things. So it's quite fast paced. It moves quite quickly. And as I say, I get to play around with things, and I'm also doing things that I love to do, like content creation, um, and that side of things. So to me, it's kind of like a natural evolution, because I always did these things, but just in smaller amounts. So as I was one of the first members of Valto, and as that company grew, anyone who's worked in a small business will kind of know you have to wear a lot of different hats. And one of those hats was always this kind of creative marketing kind of piece, but it was just a very small percentage. And then it grew and grew and grew over time. So eventually you kind of feel like you're passing off all these different hats to different people as you grow. Um, and now the company's at a size where, as I say, I can wear that sort of creative marketing hat full time.
And I mean, that's a big hat. It's got to be,
Yeah.
right? So
Yeah. Certainly
that's a
is.
big
Yeah.
hat.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
something you mentioned, and I want to elaborate. It was one of the first thing you mentioned, is that now your role is much less technical, but you're required you're required to stay up to date, because you have to give value, right? I mean, you can only talk about soft skills and different things, as a Microsoft partner so much. You got to talk about some technical stuff or enhancements that are coming out and different things. And how do you stay up to date as far as new features coming out or enhancements coming out, or um, the the whole Microsoft
Mm.
Copilot suite and everything coming out? What do you do to stay up to date as a less technical role?
Yeah. So I suppose one of the things is I've always kind of felt like, even in my technical roles, I like to see myself as like the anti-techie. Like I'm not a technical person. And in fact, before, I mean, we've had these conversations where I've joked about that. If I'm in a room of really technical people, I'm very much out of my depth in terms of kind of like all the really kind of like the sort of really detailed kind of technical knowledge and that sort of stuff. But that isn't my skill set. My skill set is to be able to communicate things and be able to look at things through the eyes of a complete beginner, and then present that back to people. And actually, a lot of the time, people get lost in things being overly technical and the waffle and the jargon and that sort of stuff. So going back to the original kind of question of how do I keep myself up to date, it's mostly from networking, and I mean that not necessarily just in person, but also things like LinkedIn, um, YouTube as well. So I know it's not quite networking, but I know a lot of the people, to be honest, like yourself and a bunch of other kind of MVPs that create content. And um, actually, I stay in touch with them quite a lot over like WhatsApp and things like that. And one of the things that we all kind of talk about is the fact that there is you it's almost a full-time job staying ahead of what's coming from Microsoft. And the complexity of that is the fact that Microsoft will publish things and put things out there like they're ready to use right now, that they're perfect, there's no problems with it, every feature's there, and blah blah blah. And I even fell into the trap of this recently. I was creating a Copilot demo, and I was putting together a scenario of how Copilot would be used by a consultant, essentially to capture requirements via Teams, print the kind of requirements off, create a report from it, then create a PowerPoint presentation to give back to a customer based on the report, and all these sort of things. So I had all these ideas, and I remembered seeing some demos from Microsoft about things which were involved in that, and I tried to do them myself, and I went, this isn't working. So I could leverage my kind of network by going to other people that I know in the industry and just saying, hey, I don't know, have you tried to do this? Have you tried to create this thing? And somebody says, oh no, that feature doesn't come out for another 4 weeks. I'm like, oh right, okay, well that makes more sense now. And I think it's just about having these open conversations, making sure you've got a network of people, making sure you say you're kind of following those types of things, because it would be a full-time job just to stay ahead of like Microsoft using their kind of websites and their roadmaps and stuff like that. You'd be there forever and a day. So although some of those things play a part in what I do, mostly it's about networking, talking to people, watching YouTube videos, finding some good people to follow who are putting out content. Because again, I like to think of myself as kind of like a SharePoint guy. Like that's my thing, is SharePoint. I've loved it, lived and breathed it for a long time. Um, but say, for example, when the whole thing was coming out about kind of Enter ID and how that all the different things which are around kind of identities and that side of the thing. Um, that wasn't my kind of bag, but I could keep semi up to date by following certain people. So the likes of Peter Rising is a friend of mine who has a YouTube channel. So I can watch his content. I can follow him on LinkedIn. So you find these guys who are like, or girls who are specialists in these different things. And then you just kind of just watch, even just from a bit of a distance, what they're talking about, what's kind of coming down the line. And that's probably the best way I found of keeping up to date.
How has your kind of technical background, and a little bit of a different question, I guess. How has your technical background, you mentioned you have a lot of experience with SharePoint and different things. How do you feel that your technical background has prepared you for the role you are in now, in a sense of, like you have this technical expertise. Back to the conversation on value, it wouldn't necessarily be advisable for somebody to become a creative director about Microsoft SharePoint and Dynamics and Power Apps without knowing,
Exactly. Yeah,
without
yeah.
having the technical experience. So how do you feel that these things have prepared you for your current role?
So it's because I've lived and breathed it. And as I say, if you put your sort of feet in the shoes of a customer, if they were only going off what, say, Microsoft was showing them and that sort of stuff and whatever, they're getting that kind of one-sided view. Whereas for me, because I've lived and breathed and used all these different products, and I've met so many different people from different companies and industries and what they're using the technologies for and that sort of stuff. It's kind of armed me with just real world experience of being able to understand people's problems, their challenges, their pain points, their fears of using some of these technologies. And then I can then create content to alleviate those fears or educate people or show them actually how people are doing it. Because again, another kind of gap in the market a little bit of that I try and take advantage of is showing people examples of stuff, like actually what are real world cases of using this, because everybody wants to know what their competitors doing and how they're using technology. And there's so many companies which are very similar, which have similar problems, similar pain points and that sort of stuff. So if they can see what other people are doing, and how they're using it, they're much more likely to adopt that technology. Does that make sense?
It does. What initially gave you a desire or led you in the direction of SharePoint or SharePoint solution development?
Um, if I'm totally honest, I fell into it. Like like the answer for most people in their career. I don't think anybody wakes up in the morning and goes, "I want to be a SharePoint consultant." Like there's no kid in sort of in school that's saying, "Oh, what do you want to be when you grow up?" "Oh, I want to be a SharePoint consultant." Like that just doesn't happen. Um, but I think it's a combination of things which kind of led me to that path. Um, my original background, going way back before SharePoint and any of those things, I was a chef. I used to work as a chef in kitchens, and I did that until I was about 18, something like that. Um, but I knew that that wasn't the path I kind of wanted to go down. Um, I knew there was a ceiling to how much money you could earn. I knew that they had a terrible social life because you had to work funny hours and things like that. And yeah, I just kind of, and without blowing my own trumpet, I felt I'd basically hit the kind of ceiling quite early at 18. I was being offered head chef jobs and things like that, and I knew there wasn't much further I could go unless I became the next Gordon Ramsay or a celebrity chef or something like that. There was not many more rungs you could kind of climb. So I kind of wanted what I thought at the time was an office job. And my dad has always been a IT program manager. So that's what he did. So long story short, um, I applied for an apprenticeship at Barclays, and it's like a fast track scheme essentially, where about 2,000 people a year apply. They whittle that down to about 250 people. They get into a room, and you're in that room for a couple of days with kind of different tests. So you probably heard those types of tests before, where they get a table of 10 people and they say, "Here's a bunch of sellotape and spaghetti. Build the biggest tower that you can build," and that sort of stuff. And then there's 10 tables of 10 people doing that. They couldn't care less how big your towers are. What they're actually doing is they're assessing people around that table. Who's the person that's just jumping in without a plan? Who's the person that's directing other people? Who's the person who just sits there and doesn't do anything until they're told? They're assessing everybody of what they do under those circumstances. There was other tests about IQ related tests of giving you a pattern, and you had to say 3 patterns, and you had to guess what the 6th pattern would be. There was things where they would give you a topic and you had to talk about it for 5 minutes straight without stopping and things like that. So they did all these different tests to whittle down. And then obviously those 250 people, I was one of, say, 10 people at the end of that process that they then took forward into Barclays and into a fast track scheme. But that I had no idea what SharePoint was at that point in time. I'd say my background was I was a chef, but also I had been kind of freelancing. My dad had a company at the time which was doing website development and things like that. So I understood what HTML was, CSS. I could kind of build websites and that sort of stuff, doing all that. So I had kind of a bit of familiarity. So then with that, they paired me at Barclays with the SharePoint development team. So I basically went straight into, they said, okay, well, these are the kind of skills you've got, and this is what we're going to do. So I basically did like a fast track scheme, and that's how I got into SharePoint. And that's how I kind of, well, at the start, it was more of a support role than anything else. But as part of that, I was exposed to doing a bit of development and that sort of thing. And I really enjoyed that time there. And that's basically how I got into SharePoint. And then it kind of snowballed basically from there. I just kind of stuck with it from that point in time, and led to all those different roles that you talked about before.
If you are thinking to yourself that you want to get into low-code development or learn about the Power Platform, then I want to personally invite you to sign up for this completely free self-paced course that is going to cover everything you need to know to begin low-code development today. Not too long ago, I was a complete beginner and I had no idea what I was doing. I didn't even know what the Power Platform was. The content in this course is handpicked by me so you can understand the basics of the Power Platform and ultimately be prepared to take the PL 900 certification if that's something you're interested in. If you are interested, be sure to follow the first link in the description down below, and do not forget to use the promo code YouTube at checkout in order to get the course for completely free. This is going to give you immediate access to the entire course so that you can start to change your future today. Now, let's get back to the conversation. So admittedly, I know pretty much nothing about SharePoint. Definitely less than I should as a Power Apps and Dynamics consultant. But I mean, I understand what it is, but I haven't necessarily been a part of an implementation that um, that needed, intense, you know, SharePoint development,
Mm.
anything like that. And so, I guess my question, I would love to, high level, what kind of advice would you have for somebody that is thinking being a SharePoint consultant might be beneficial, or like places you would recommend that they start, and
Okay.
someone who's a beginner just like me?
Yeah. So um, with SharePoint, there's a couple of different aspects to it. So I think the most commonly known aspect of SharePoint is that it's for document storage. And even, I mean, as a Dynamics consultant yourself and understanding Dynamics, there is a SharePoint integration essentially. So for Dynamics, you can store documents directly in SharePoint. If I'm totally honest, as being on the SharePoint side of the fence, because I've worked on major projects before where I'm the SharePoint guy and there's a Dynamics guy there, and I'm doing the SharePoint side of the fence and Dynamics doing the Dynamics side of the fence. And I must admit, I don't really like that integration because it just looks a bit ugly. It's not very user friendly, and it assumes that everything is always going to be done from Dynamics. So yeah, there's a bit of a kind of love hate relationship between Dynamics and SharePoint. Um, but yeah, so in general, that's a kind of there's document storage, which most people know. A lot of people are starting to realize as well that Microsoft Teams, the back end of Microsoft Teams, is also SharePoint. So if you're using Microsoft Teams and you're using files, you're already using SharePoint without probably even realizing you are. And then there's the category which I would say I'm most passionate about, which is intranets. So intranets are like an internal website essentially. So it's where people can store documents which if I was to give kind of like a piece of value, something away as part of this session, it's where you store your kind of documents. And I get this question asked all the time of in Microsoft 365, where do I store documents? So I would say there's three areas. You've got OneDrive, which is like your personal document storage space where you store things. You've got Microsoft Teams, which is like your collaborational space, is where you work on a day-to-day basis with your department and share documents, things like that. And then as a separate category, I say SharePoint intranets. And SharePoint intranets are essentially where they're the documents that um, the whole organization should have access to, but it's most likely read access. They're things like policies, procedures, forms, handbooks, guides, training materials, branded materials, all these different things that people need to access on a day-to-day basis. And then there's the documents of the intranet, but then there's the kind of information side. So it's like the news articles, almost like the blog type element to it, and pulling out information and that sort of stuff. So typical things intranets kind of give you, and that's much more my passion. I would say, like, if you and they're gonna selfishly plug my own YouTube channel here, but if you look at my YouTube channel, which is just at Dougie Wood, most of my content is about the design aspect of SharePoint because that's mostly what intrigues me, and I think it stems from the story I was just telling about working at Barclays. I remember working with SharePoint when it was SharePoint in 2003, which is it wasn't 2003 that I was using it, so it was way out of date at that point. I think I was probably using it well, they had SharePoint 2003, 2007, 2010, and they were just about to roll out 2013, and that wasn't that was they were running all of them at the same time. Different areas of the bank were using different versions of SharePoint, but it was very clunky, the old versions of SharePoint, and it was on premise. It was very clunky and very horrible, and yeah, it just wasn't great. But I always had this passion to try and make things as but going back to this point of being the anti-techie, although I do know a bit about HTML, CSS, and these different types of things, I think you can always go very far with SharePoint out of the box, and you don't always need to have these customizational pieces. And I was always passionate about showing how far SharePoint could go out of the box, and that was essentially what kind of got me to that point, really.
Why is it so important for companies to have a well-designed SharePoint? And this isn't necessarily a trick question. I know
Hmm.
you would say it is. I guess my question is why?
So, the, if you look at the main reasons why you should have SharePoints, the fundamental reasons, it's all about making information easier to access, reducing duplications. Like the amount of companies that I've seen where somebody has like something saved on their local computer, or they've got it saved in a like their own OneDrive or something like that, or they've got it saved in a shared drive somewhere, and it's saved here and there and everywhere. And then there's so many times that people are turning up to meetings and going, "Oh, hang on, I've got an old version of this board pack or this document. And why have you got a new one? Or where's this? Or I updated that last week. Why can't you see the changes?" And all these different things. It all comes down to the fact they've got messy documents that are living all over the place. So a lot of it is about making sure that things are easy to find, accessible, and getting that kind of information in the right place. So even as a starting point, forget the fancy intranet and the kind of news and blogs and all that side of things. Forget all of that. The starting point really is to make sure that your documents are stored in the right place. Personal stuff in OneDrive, department stuff in Teams, and then all the things which are like the wider org stuff in a SharePoint internet form. And that doesn't have to be overly fancy to start with. It could just be a library in SharePoint called policies, and you store policies there. And anyone who stores a policy anywhere else, you can hit them with a big stick because you've told them it lives in SharePoint in the policies library, and that's where you can find it. So it makes it easier. And especially when, say, for companies which are growing and they have onboarding processes and people are like coming and joining and that sort of stuff, SharePoint's fantastic to be able to point them and say, here's all our policies. Go and read these policies. As part of the first week of our introduction, you can read our policies here. You can find our processes. You can find out the way we do things. And something which is really interesting now is we can also apply Copilot over the top of SharePoint. So this is something that I've been dabbling with recently, and I think it's the next generation of how people are going to interact with company data, information, policies, procedures, that sort of stuff. Because you can apply Copilot, like a custom Copilot, over the top of SharePoint. So I actually did this as a test internally. We have a number of different SharePoint sites which are owned by departments, and they put on their SharePoint sites how they do things. Like if, say, for example, what I built was actually a Copilot which looked at our support team, our support desk, essentially, their SharePoint site. So they could ask, using Copilot, they could ask a chatbot type of interface to say, what do I do when I'm onboarding a new customer? And then it would go off, look at SharePoint, and pull back the information and say, what you need to do is get the customer's details, buy them a license, deploy them a laptop, whatever it is, blah, 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 these different things. But all of that was fed from a combination of SharePoint pages and documents which are stored on that SharePoint site. And it wasn't like it was drastically complicated to do. There was no programming involved with it. It was essentially a Copilot has this kind of Copilot Studio wizard, which will guide you through the path of building out this type of thing. So I think that although there's still a massive wave of people that still aren't in this kind of world of a SharePoint intranet and that sort of stuff, the bleeding edge of that is now that there's that eventually there'll be a large portion of people that will never even interface with SharePoint as a website. They'll interface with it via a GPT chat interface, just because they'll type into it, how many holidays do I get this year? And it will go and look at the policy and come back and say, you get 25 days holiday plus a day off for your birthday, or whatever it is, because it's pulled it from that policy. So I think that's the future, and that's why you should have it ready and set out, because this is all things which are coming down the line.
This is probably the easiest segue. You teed this up beautifully. That was kind of my next question. Is okay. It's important for companies to have good designs, SharePoints, and to be organized. How much more so now that Microsoft Copilot and things are being introduced into the Microsoft suite and specifically into SharePoint? We could probably talk about Copilot for 2 hours on here, but the introduction of Microsoft Copilot, how does that impact SharePoint design, SharePoint solution development, and everything?
So I would say the first thing is, and this isn't fear mongering, but the first thing I would say is it's going to shine a spotlight on potential data and security issues that you don't even know you have. They exist currently, but you don't know that you have them. And what I mean by that is there is potential that you have documents stored all over the place, which we've already discussed before. There's a potential that you've got documents which are outdated. They're policies, procedures which no one's touched, but everybody kind of internally knows to say, oh, those are our old policies. We've not looked at them in years. Forget it, right? But Copilot won't know that. Copilot, you'll ask it a question. You'll say, how many holidays do I have left? And it will go and look at those old policies and come back and say, I found these policies and procedures. And if you're a new starter and you don't know that those old documents are old, and it presents it back up to you, it might be presenting old information. It could go further than that. There could be security risks where, and I've seen this service, not through Copilot, but in years gone by. There's a product in Microsoft 365 that's called Delve. And Delve, some of my kind of like friends, we lovingly referred to it as the kind of office snitch, because it would actually tell you what people are working on and what files and things were in place. And this is way before Copilot. That Delve's been around for ages. But what it would also do is surface things that you might not know that you had access to. So, say for example, if a folder was stored in a management SharePoint site, and for some reason people didn't realize that that management SharePoint site was open to everybody, people might not have gone looking for those files, but they could have done. They could have gone looking for them, but they just didn't. Delve surfaced some of those files to people, and that's where it shined its head. And we'll see exactly the same thing happen when it comes to Copilot, because people start asking questions, and technically they're trying to sort of, they'll try and find things, or they might not even realize they're maliciously doing it, but they'll ask questions, and Copilot won't know what to bring back. So the structure needs to be in place to make sure that Copilot can be applied, and it's only surfacing up information that people should have access to. Essentially, that's the kind of like the be prepared kind of element of it. But there's going to be so many positives to it. As I say, there's going to be a new generation of people, and if you look back at the different generations of people who have worked in office kind of jobs and things like that, how they look for documents and files and things like that is going to be different. Do you know what I mean? Like my dad's generation, who's in the kind of boomer category, will very much heavily rely on File Explorer and things like that, and they'll want to see a folder structure. They love folder structures. They love going through those different things. But then different generations, as you go down, will approach the way that they find information differently. And I don't know quite yet where it's going to hit, but there's going to be a new generation of people that expect to find things via a human interacting kind of GPT type of interface. They don't want to have to go to folders and go to HR and then policies and then leave request policies and then drill that. They don't want to do that. They'll just want to ask a question, say, how many holidays have I got? And it will go away and find that and come back to you with that kind of way of working. So, as I say, it's about preparing and making sure that you've got all your kind of ducks in a row, so that when these types of things happen, and they will happen, that you're ready for it. And my kind of prediction is that Copilot is going, well, not just Copilot, but sort of chat bots, GPTs, things like that, whatever. All of this AI piece is going to be as big as kind of what the internet did for business. AI is going to be as big, if not bigger, transformationally for business.
Awesome. I don't think there's anything I can add there. I completely agree. I think it's, but I would, and it sounds like your sentiment overall is the benefits outweigh the costs, but it's more of like Copilot isn't introducing security risks. It's just exposing them,
Exactly.
And so super cool. I would love to kind of to not completely transition the conversation, but what kind of made you go from being, involved with SharePoint into your transition into business applications and Power Apps in kind of that career shift, I guess?
So I like to think of it, it wasn't necessarily a career shift. It was like an add-on, essentially. It's like a bolt-on. And the reason being is because what I tend to... So, rolling back a little bit, I can't remember what year it was, but there was definitely like a sense in the SharePoint world that you you needed to have some additional skills to be able to customize and almost, although I've kind of said I like to get SharePoint out of the box as far as you can possibly take it, there's always going to be scenarios where you need to be able to take it further, that step further. And to me, because I've been in SharePoint for ages, and this is going to make me sound like a dinosaur, but I originally was kind of used to using SharePoint Designer as the kind of tool for kind of doing advanced things, and I was used to using InfoPath, which is well gone now. I can't remember when InfoPath went, but InfoPath was a way of like, it was like Power Apps essentially, where you could design forms which sit on top of SharePoint. So I used those tools, but eventually they kind of like, it was all announced that SharePoint Designer was going away, InfoPath was going away, and it was being replaced with Power Automate, Power Apps, or if you were a I almost said real techie then, but I mean, if you were kind of like a programmer, there was what they call SPFX, which is essentially JavaScript. Now, that isn't me. I could take someone else's kind of code and, I mean, stick it together with some shoestring and sellotape and make it work type of thing. But it's as I say, I'm not that level of techie. So I knew it was almost like everybody in the SharePoint world at that point in time flipped a coin, and you either went down the Power Platform route and understood Power Apps and build customizations using Power Apps, or you went down the SPFX route. And as I kind of myself and my company that I was working with at the time made the decision that Power Apps was the best route to go down, and that paid off. And I would say, in retrospect, the companies which chose to go down that route rather than SPFX probably did better in the grand scheme of things, because there's so many more kind of avenues you can kind of take it down, and it opens up a big kind of worms. And as I say, I promise I am not a techie, but I do have the PL600 exam, which is the Power Platform Solution Architect. And I kind of know a lot about, so it kind of started off by going down the route of understanding Canvas apps. And I would say in my journey of Power Apps, 80% of it has been Canvas apps, because it's the Canvas apps which you can use for free, essentially, with SharePoint. And it took a long time for people to start to transition into thinking about model-driven apps, Power Apps Portals, which is now referred to as Power Pages, and those kind of avenues. It took a long time to almost like get people on board with that and understanding those. So we did a lot of kind of Canvas apps using that side of things. So yeah, to summarize, it was because we needed to be able to do customizations, and Power Platform just looked like it was going to be the better route rather than trying to reskill as a JavaScript SPFX developer.
Awesome. I think that's great in the transition there. I wanted to talk about something else with you. You know, you are clearly a good communicator, and you're talking about you're not a techie, you know, all right, I guess, you know, as much as you're talking about all this technical stuff, but you know, you're a good communicator. Why, in your opinion, is it so important for consultants, architects, creative directors to have both the technical skills, but more importantly, the soft skills and the communication skills?
Sure. So it doesn't. There's a famous quote that I wish I'd remembered, but it basically words the effect of that it doesn't matter how good your work is, if you can't communicate it, people will never know about it, essentially. And I see that through my career. I found people who are so technical, they know loads of stuff, but they kind of hide away and nobody really knows them. They don't necessarily make much kind of progression in their careers and things like that because they just don't get noticed. And it depends on the type of role that you're doing, I guess. A lot of the roles basically all of the roles, actually, thinking about it, I've never had a role that I'm hiding away, essentially. I've always been customer facing. So it's always required me to have those kind of skills. And depending on what type of role it is, will depend on how much soft skills and how much you need to be able to communicate. So starting at kind of like the most technical, say if you're a developer, you there's certain levels of developers that probably never see daylight. They're just locked in a dark room building stuff all day, and they never really speak to anybody. And then as you get to being at the point of, even as a senior developer, you probably need to have some level of soft skills that you're probably going to be talking to a at least a project manager, if not maybe even the client when you're getting brought into those kind of situations. Then you kind of like transition to if you're technical but you can talk to people, and you can kind of gather requirements and that sort of stuff, you might become like a business analyst, or you might become a consultant in whatever it was. So that's where, like, as I say, I was a SharePoint consultant for a long period of time. And it's still, again, it's a technical role that you have to understand things technically. I sort of, I've done all kind of levels of consultancy, from going out and speaking to people, gathering requirements, letting them know about best practices and how things should be set up. Um, for a period of time as well, I was kind of doing what I call like parachute consulting, which is basically where when there's a lot of kind of projects running, as a parachute consultant, I was not necessarily always assigned to be a full-time resource on something. But say, for example, if there was a technical hiccup or something felt like it was going off the rails, but it was a bit bumpy or whatever, as a consultant, I'd parachute in and look at the situation and say, okay, this is maybe what we need to do. This is what we should focus on. And it wasn't just from a technical aspect; it was also how to deal with a customer, what we might need to do to resolve things. Quite often, as a consultant, you would have to have the skills to be able to see the vision of the customer. So, what do they actually want to achieve? But also be able to go back to the developers and explain that, because the consultant is that kind of middle ground, right? That the customer can never explain to the techie developer what they want, and the techie developer needs to kind of have some level of technical understanding to be able to produce the product or whatever it is you're building, the solution. So that kind of role, it was important that you could go and speak to a customer and make sure you never use any technical language. I would almost aim to not even mention any of the product. I barely even mention that it's Power Apps or SharePoint or whatever it was we're using. I barely even mention it at all. I was more approaching and say, well, what's the problem? What are you trying to solve? What is it? What's the outcome? What does this mean to you if we get this right? And I would understand that, and I would get the vision, and I would need to spend a couple of days with them to understand what that vision was, why they're doing it, what's the importance of this solution, before I could then go back and then create a report, which it had to do two things. It had to meet in the middle ground between the two parties, because we, as in the customer and the technical developers, because you need to be able to explain it back to the customer so they know, yes, that's right, it's exactly our vision, that's what we need, but also be able to tangibly note down what it is that we're doing so the developer knows, okay, we're going to need a table, we're going to need these fields, we're going to need this workflow, we're going to need these things, blah blah blah, so they understand technically what they're going to get as well. So I think it's very important to get those soft skills right, but it will depend on what type of job role that you're trying to get into.
What advice would you have for someone? Maybe they're introverted, maybe they don't feel like they have the communication skills, where they don't feel like they are able to bridge that social gap between customer and technical developer that we're talking about.
So, I mean, obviously it depends. As I say, it depends what your goals are and where you want to try and get to. Um, there's rungs to climb, and it's not like soft skills are um, essential for all roles. It just depends on what type of role you want to do. I've met some people who are developers that really want to be a consultant, and they need to kind of improve a little bit on those kind of like soft skills and that sort of stuff. I am quite a strong believer in, you need to be outside of your comfort zone. And I don't just mean lob people in the deep end just for the fun of it. That's not what I mean. And I think that some of my kind of success in life is the fact that I have found myself occasionally in the deep end, and I've always felt that I'm always out of my comfort zone. Um, Almost always. It was actually something I can't remember if it was might have been Simon Sinek or someone like that on YouTube. I was watching a video that was talking about your comfort zone being like a circle, and you will never learn anything. You don't learn anything new by doing the same thing all the time. You have to be outside of that zone. But there's different levels of stress. If you're too far away, it's almost like, think about it like if it was a hula hoop or like a circle on the ground. you have one leg in the circle and one leg out of the circle, and if things get a bit too much, you can move back inside the circle, your comfort zone. But if you stay in the comfort zone all the time, you're never going to learn, you're never going to grow, you're never going to expand. And as you get more comfortable, that circle gets bigger and bigger and bigger. So if you imagine your confidence is this small circle, just try and do small things like um, try and spark up a conversation that you wouldn't have attempted previously, and slowly grow that out into maybe try and do a presentation, maybe try and find a way that you can present something. A really good place to kind of um, use as a testing ground is at Microsoft user groups. So Microsoft user groups, essentially in every town, in every city around the world, there'll be people who are into Microsoft technologies who will get together. For me, my local ones are like Manchester City Centre, but there's been ones I've been to in London and Birmingham and things like that as well. And I use it as an opportunity for public speaking. Basically, I was terrified of public speaking. And although I could do kind of chats face to face with people, I could do boardrooms and things like that. But getting up in front of 20, 30, 100, 200 people, quite daunting. So I just thought, well, I'm going to take what's the worst that can happen? Do you know what I mean, what is the worst that can happen? That I bomb, that it's terrible, people didn't like it. It's not the end of the world. Luckily, most of these events aren't recorded. You can learn from them, you can move on, and things like that. So some of my early days of presenting were just awful. Like I would speak really fast, I would and ah a lot, I would forget what I was kind of talking about and have to look at my slides all the time, things like that. But you only kind of grow your comfort zone by doing things and almost forcing yourself to do a little bit of those pieces.
Yeah. I think those things are great. For the sake of time, I would love to transition us to kind of our more fun, lighthearted section of the show, the after hours happy hour. And there's one topic that we actually haven't talked about, and that's your Microsoft MVP.
Yeah,
And not so much as Microsoft MVP. I would love to just kind of talk to you about uh, being a YouTube creator and what that's
yeah.
like, and different things, and maybe kind of why you chose to begin creating on YouTube and different things like that.
Sure, sure. So yeah, I mean the it originally sort of started. I mean, this sounds like a really long-winded story now, and it probably will end up being one. But
Yeah.
I've always been interested in video production. I've always been interested in video production. Even as a teenager, I used to hang around on skate parks quite a lot. I was terrible at skateboarding. I would attempt it, I would try it, but fall over most of the time. But what I did used to really enjoy doing was I would video my friends skateboarding and then edit them into like almost like I don't know what we thought we were, or if we were going to get sponsored or something, but I would edit them into these kind of like promo type videos and stuff. Um, they never really went anywhere or did anything, but I just enjoyed the process of creating the content. And early days, they weren't even on YouTube. I can't even remember what platforms they would have been on it back then, but so that just kind of got me interested into that. And I was very close at one point also as part of the kind of not knowing what to do after being a chef. I was looking at doing a degree in kind of some kind of um, film production or something like that, whatever. So I was always interested in that type of that world. And as I've been doing videos for my company YouTube channel for 5 years, something like that. And like with anything, they're terrible to start with, awful. And actually, I saw a video recently from a YouTuber who's called Mr. Beast, who's like the number one YouTuber of all time.
Oh yeah.
Um, yeah. But he actually talked about how YouTube is like an iterative process, that you will not get it right the first time. You won't get it right your first 100 videos. But he said what you should do is every single time you create a video, iterate, make something better than it was last time. Whether that's the thumbnail image, whether it's the kind of the pause, the timing, whatever it is, like always improve. So I kind of did that with my company's YouTube channel over years, understanding what worked, what didn't work, that sort of stuff. And eventually, I found myself, as I say, talking at user groups and surrounding myself with MVPs. And a lot of people were kind of like, well, like, why have you not been recognized an MVP, or what you're doing could be recognized an MVP? And actually, a friend of mine at the time who was an MVP said, all the content and stuff and all the things that you do are really good, but they will never be recognized to become an MVP unless you do it under your own name. To become an MVP, you have to be giving out content, you have to be doing it under your own name. And that was the kind of catalyst which made me start my own YouTube channel and run my company YouTube channel, which is a lot more advertising, promotional, that sort of stuff, and whatever, trying to generate leads, versus my own channel, which is more kind of educational, trying to get people to understand more about SharePoint and what you can use it for. And that's what essentially led me to that. But as I say, I've just always enjoyed, and YouTube as a platform, I've just always enjoyed. Like, I prefer long form content. I do have a team of people who work in, as a creative director. I do have people who work with me, and some of them are a lot younger than me, and they're a lot more into like TikTok and short form videos and things like that. And I think there is a place for that. But as I say, my kind of generation, like the millennial generation, um, platforms like Instagram and YouTube and things like that are a lot more kind of like our platforms. So although I can see the purpose of TikToks, and I think it's important, and we are looking and we're starting investigations of using that as a platform, I've always just preferred long form content.
Awesome. I completely agree with everything you said there. I feel like, so my first two videos on the Citizen Developer channel are actually kind of like AI 900 study guides. It's a Microsoft certification, and
Yeah.
they are still, they're doing really well. Like, they're still getting several hundred views a month. But my first video in particular, it is so bad. I am so embarrassed about it, because it's just like, but but now I feel like my content's starting to get to a place where I'm a little bit more proud of it, and happy with it. But it's like, of course, my first and my worst video is
Yeah.
doing well, whatever. But hey, I'm not complaining, not complaining. I guess I just wish it was my newer, better videos. But you know,
Yeah.
Dougie, I've loved being able to connect with you and talk about everything we have. If somebody wanted to connect with you and reach out, what would be the best way to get in contact with you?
So yeah, you can contact me. The best place probably is LinkedIn. I use LinkedIn all the time. It's how me and you speak most of the time, to be fair. So LinkedIn is probably the best place to get me. So yeah, just search Dougie Wood. You'll find me. You see a cheesy picture of me, probably with my beard. You'll recognize me a mile off.
Yeah, I'll have that. Be sure to have a link to Dougie's LinkedIn in the comments down below. Dougie, man, thank you for being here. Thank you to you for sticking to end the video. My name is Griffin Lickfelt, the host of Citizen Developer, and I'm excited to connect with you guys in the next one.